This evening is one of those very special events in architecture where a book of great quality, no doubt, I haven't read it, but undoubtedly can look forward to something perhaps, if it's anything like as good as Paul's earlier book, What is Architecture, which caused a complete sensation about 5 years ago in here, a number of places, and in America. Then it is one of those very particular events this evening. My name's Mike Gold. My claim to fame is I'm Paul's introducer. Book is called The Cultivated Wilderness, and it's accompanied by an exhibition in the bar upstairs of material arising from his research, including some paintings, 4 or 5 paintings by Paul. Paul graduated from the A in 1972, and at that time, for 2 or 3 years in the diploma school, Paul was one of 2 or 3 students at that time whose work was personally unique and sensational. It changed a lot of people's... I can remember 3 or 4 projects of Paul's at school. I'm much older than he is, and I was long in practice while he was doing this, but the ripples and waves of what he did reached us in practice, heads down. At that time, 3 or 4 projects in particular. Since then, the things that I happen to know about Paul myself include that he started a club called the London Architecture Club, which was a magnificent enterprise of the kind that achieves fame, and then people research it years afterwards because it has disappeared long ago as well. But it too was a sensational kind of personal gathering of London architects and others with incredibly cunningly devised events and lectures which were quite riveting. I can't go into those. Taught in the diploma school with myself and with Jean Sillett and Peter Wilson and others during the 70s and 80s, and has been teaching at several other places since. During a teaching period, there were sort of other sensations, such as, let's see, figurative architecture was invented. I think Paul was something to do with that in the late 70s as well. Certainly something to do with it as far as I was concerned. I wrote a book called People in Architecture that was influenced by finding myself teaching with Paul. And then another thing I remember is a theory called demolition, which we arose as a result of Paul's very original thinking, and which infected me and which I've suffered from ever since, and it explains my whole problem ever since the 1980s. Latterly, he then taught with Jean Sillett and created a course at University of Westminster called Land and something. Can't remember what it's called. Anyway, the point is that it is a unique way that architecture and the land or landscape are viewed together as one. His first book, the book What is Architecture, I'm sure you all know, so I won't say much about it. except that not only in its content, but in the style of the book itself, in the graphics, in the construction of the way the book itself is put together, in the literary style with which it's assembled, had a great deal to say in all these media, including in the purely academic, if you like, content. He has a very strange, I have to warn you in case you don't know, he has a very strange lecturing style. Tends to be sort of extremely modest, while at the same time being absolutely saying sensational things. You'll get used to this if you haven't had it before. I feel I need to warn you. The current book, Cultivated Wilderness, carries a subtitle, Or What is Landscape? So it fits, as do many of the events that Paul has created, into a set of categories. There are categories and a kind of assembly of features to his output which coordinate, kind of architecturally coordinated set of things. I think we'll call it finished there. The book is published now and is available, and I think will be available to buy after the lecture in the exhibition space for a lucky few. And it just remains to introduce Paul. Welcome, brother. Welcome, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Is my mic on? Yes, it is. Right, thanks, Mike. And thanks to Moisen for asking me to do the exhibition here, and to everybody for coming. The Cultivated Wilderness has been a very difficult title for me right from the beginning. And the guys at MIT didn't like it. Roger Conover, who's the commissioning editor, said it's so professorial. And I know what he means. I think he thinks that the cultivated wilderness sounds like one of those oxymorons, like the only constant is change. And I don't like those kind of things at all. But it's not that. It's the cultivated wilderness is a reconciliation between the two. And anyway, I am a professor. I get letters addressed to Professor Shepherd. I have no chair. I'm a nomad professor. And it's great to be in London. I've lived here all my life, and I noticed the other day that the tip of the dome of St. Paul's is exactly the same height as the hills on either side of the city. And some of you may have heard that before. But this lecture is about, well, the book also is characterized as seeing things which are too big to see, which I know is, I was really thinking about the Hubble telescope, which is the thing I love, and it looks out and it can see 14 billion years to the edge of the universe. It can see the beginning of time. And I think if you just took everything else away but St. Paul's and the Hubble, I think we'd have a civilization. Landscape, obviously this is going to be a talk about landscape in a wider sense than landscape architecture. And it's going to be more about landscape which is more active than scenery, which is you know, what you see when you go to Switzerland. And I want to use this kind of word more and more often, actually. I think it would be good to be not so snobby about these things. How is it? Kath Schoenfield is always writing about broderie anglaise, as though it were a crime, because it's, you know, redolent of women's realm and all that. But so what? The artifact is innocent. And as I've framed it in the book, the wilderness is everything that was there before the humans came. And the cultivation is everything that the humans have done to it since. And landscape could be is a name for the strategies which have governed this cultivation. It means that the cultivation is wider than architecture, or maybe architecture is wider than I ever thought it would be. I think it would be including farming and all the machines, everything we do to our bodies, the lip implants, all that, nipple piercing. But the architecture that we regulate and register, and which is the Institute of British Architects, is the buildings bit. And to say it's set into a landscape is a bit like calling it scenery, but I think it's set in a strategy which is sort of unspoken, that when you get an office block to do, or a block of flats to do, or something, there is a strategy there which is turning the land to profit. The strategy we have for the land is we own bits of it and we turn it to profit. And when you do a building of a conventional type, that's the one you're dealing in. There's obviously more ways to deal with the world than that. I think the money is convenient because it's so general and it can get in absolutely everywhere. I've got some slides of examples of things which are rather different. Right. Now, forward. Yeah. Now this is stones with meaning. Hilary French once said to me that she'd come across a definition of architecture as stones with meaning. Can you still hear this? Yeah. And this thing on the left is, it's a huge thing that sticks out of the landscape in Texas, middle of Texas. Texas is 100 times bigger than England, but you can't go on any of it because it's all fenced off and privately owned, except for enchanted rock. And this is a big pink granite thing that sticks out of the ground, a bit like Ayers Rock, not that big. And it's very hot in Texas, and in the cold nights, the rock, the top layer of rock cracks and shatters off, and so there's this sort of smooth dome across there, and all of the surrounding countryside is filled with these hunks of granite, and the noise when these things crack must be fantastic. And the Comanches revered it as enchanted rock. Comanche. John Wayne says Comanche. Now this thing, London Bridge was demolished in the 1830s, and the stone that made it was sold to somebody to build a mansion for himself in Rotherhithe. The mansion's still there, empty, derelict. And somebody wants to buy the thing and use the stones to rebuild London Bridge in a theme park in Barking. Now, yeah, enchanted stones. The things themselves have the quality, you see. They're like pieces of the Temple of Artemis, the living thing. I think it's ridiculous too. But that's what these Millennium projects are like, isn't it? They're all like that. The Earth Resources Centre or the National Discovery Park. These things are not really about anything else except the lottery fund. They're farming the lottery fund. What's so tantalizing about them, though, is that these themes that the theme parks have are really strategies. They could be. And I think whenever I talk about strategy in this lecture, I'm really thinking about themes in that sense. But I hope the position is more profound than that one. I'm not sure. This is another thing, which is another one of these funny furores that's going on. This is a photograph by Richard Davies, which was published recently, of the big tower that Foster's planning to put in next to the commercial building. Now, it's easy enough to not like it, isn't it? And some of the arguments I read were straight political arguments, as you'd expect. Why spend all that money on that when you could spend it on schools and hospitals, housing the homeless? And there are other more insulting things about it like it's just a phallic ego trip, which I'm not so sure about. I don't get that one. I was with a friend in the West Country, one of those little towns like Ludlow, and he said to me, "Look at that building, it's painted the colour of shit." And I turned around and looked at it, and it was bright yellow, bright buttercup yellow. I thought, what do you eat? But there must be a way to approach this as an aesthetic strategy. This is another familiar one. London, the shape of London is the basin, with St. Paul's in the middle of it. Tip of the dome. Wait a minute, it's the basin, it's the chalk, which comes up to Croydon on one side and up to Elstree on the other. And on top of that is a layer of clay, and there are two little inlying hills, one of which is the Hampstead-Highgate Ridge, and the other is the Sydenham Crystal Palace Ridge, and the city's in the middle here. And in between these inner hills is where London was in 1900. If you go out, the later development of London spreads over and on up to Croydon. Now this is a picture taken from Elstree, which is the northern range of the outlier. And it's looking back across Hampstead Heath. Those are the trees of Hampstead Heath. No, you can't see it. Damn. That's Canary Wharf. Can you see it? NatWest Tower, believe me, is just about there, and that's the telecom tower there. They just peep over the top. You can't see St. Paul's because the tip of St. Paul's is the same height as Hampstead Hill. Now, there are two strategies here. One is that the area is crisscrossed by, the country is crisscrossed by radio waves, which are broadcast from these telecom towers. It has to be that height to get over the top of the hill. I've heard that there isn't a higher point between there and York. But there may be other towers. It's classified information like everything else in England. The other strategy is being higher than anything else in the patch, which is one of those absurd ones, but it could possibly be profound, building the highest thing there is. People, ever since I've gone on about this tip of the dome of St. Paul's thing, people have been coming out to me saying, no, it isn't. I was up on Highgate Hill, it's not. So, it's true that the picture in the book is not quite right. Because from Parliament Hill, you see it against the backdrop of the Orpington Gap, which is next to Croydon in that line. And the hill in question really is the Crystal Palace Hill. So if you have to come around a bit further to get the actual view. This is from Alexandra Palace. There's the Dome of St. Paul's, and that shadow line there is the inlying hill. That's a view of Crystal Palace from Alexandra Palace. And this one is actually taken from the end of that ridge down here somewhere at Forest Hill, which is the end of that line. And that's Alexandra Palace on the horizon. And there's the tip of the dome. See? It fills up it fills up London. It is London. Mike, who introduced me just now, pointed out that he discovered that Silbury Hill, you know, which is that mysterious did Joseph of Arimathea build it thing down in the Kennet Valley near the Long Kennet Mound, that also is the same height as the surrounding hills. So there's Crystal and Alexandra. This is a whole other thing about London. I went to all that effort to get the picture of the Eiffel Tower. Did you notice it a little earlier on? Because that Foster thing is the same sort of height as the Eiffel Tower, 1,000 feet high. And here is St. Paul's looking like London's tourist icon from Westminster Bridge. And that's inside St. Paul's. It's really a shot of the cash registers. That's what I wanted to get. Because there are two down here, and there's one on the postcard stand, and there's one at the entrance to the Golden Gallery. There are 8 cash registers in St. Paul's Cathedral. You could write an anthem for them. So the response, of course, is to clear all that stuff out. It's been done before. Cromwell did it. All the commerce and traffic that used to be in Old St. Paul's was cleared out. This is a church. Get out of here. Knocked down all the statues, painted white. And the commerce is back now, but it's this tourist thing. You could clear it all out. And a similar thing is expressed by several people about these bloody towers in the city. Knock them down, they obscure the churches. This is Canaletto's drawing of where Blackfriars Bridge is now, looking at St. Paul's, and there are the churches. And in all those Canaletto panoramas, this beautiful thing of the sort of level ground of brown brick London with the churches sticking up. And it is an inspiriting sight. It must have been fantastic. But a thought occurred to me the other day that when all this was destroyed by the fire in 1666, just completely destroyed. And the idea was to build it back, big cathedral, and put it at the end of a big boulevard. It would have been the first big European city with all these boulevards lined up, statues on axis and everything, but they couldn't afford to buy the freeholds. And so they resolved on a different strategy, which was to build these little churches all over the place, put all the money into building back the churches in order to pump prime, as we would say, the activity of the city back, to get the city back and make people think it was worth doing. Which is what they did, and it's what happened, and the city became successful. The idea was, build the churches, we'll have the city successful. And the city became so successful that it got really big and obscured the churches. And I think it's implied in the strategy in the first place that churches were eventually to become obscured. That was the point, by success. This is cultivated wilderness. A few words on cultivated wilderness. Bridget Bardot is washed and scented. Her hair's dyed. Her face is painted. She wears these clothes. She takes this pose. Everything that she's doing and has is cultivated, except that she is a wild creature. The ski lift out there is apparently a piece of cultivation in the wilderness, but it too is made of concrete and steel. And the concrete's rocks ground up, and the cement's dug out and processed. The stuff is ferried up there in trucks made of metal, which is made of iron ore and using oil that's been mined from the ground. Everything that's made, everything that we've got has been made out of wilderness. This is the first wilderness story. Can we have a little focus on Adam and Eve there? Isn't this great? This is the doors of Hildesheim Cathedral near Hanover. And they have just been cast out of paradise. And I think they look desperate about it. Oh God, shall I be blessing us? It's the first wilderness story. The idea is that after the paradise was flat, it had one warm season where flowers and fruits burgeoned all the time, and the animals all lived in peace. When they were expelled from paradise, they broke the world. And it became a land of deserts and mountains and wildernesses and winter and savage beasts. There's a fascinating book by John Prest called The Garden of Eden, which it relates this really interesting theory about the Crusaders going out to recapture Jerusalem for Christianity, to try and right the matters of the world. And sending the Crusades out, enormous ragged armies of people going out there there are stories of people at their workshops when the armies of people go past and they say, where are you going? We're going to free Jerusalem. And they put down their tools and they join in. And it didn't work. Islam held on to Jerusalem, and in 1300 the whole thing was over. It couldn't be done. And Press' theory was that at that point the church said, maybe we can find the Garden of Eden. It's probably down here in the Horn of Africa somewhere. Instead of going through that way, we could maybe sail around the bottom of Africa and find it that way. And the expedition started going out in the late 1400s to try and find the Garden of Eden. And on finding it, you would be able to find out how to remake the broken world back into what it should be. Phew. But the point was that whenever they found somewhere that looked as though it might be paradise, in South America they might come across a tribe of Indians living there naked, fruit on the trees, clams in the river, doing no work, sitting around making love, talking as they did on the barricades in 1968 in Paris. This is Bernard Tschumy's story. You remember hearing him decide to talk and make love. And every time they're hungry, they reach up and they pluck a fruit from the tree. No work. Warm all the time. Every time they thought they'd found paradise, they would then look at this fruit and realize that this was not described in the Bible or Aristotle or Pliny or anywhere. That the Bible and the ancient authors were not sufficient explanation for the world. After all, they set out to discover the Garden of Eden and discovered rationality. And at the end of this long period of discovery, the last thing to be found was Antarctica. They looked for it for a long while. It was eventually found by people killing seals, hunting seals, and farming pelts and oil. And all the outlying islands have these huge flocks of seals on which the sealers would go in and wipe out and then move on to the next island and get closer and closer into the continent until it was finally named, really, and taken on. This was about in the 1830s, and it coincided with a new kind of science, evolution, geophysics, magnetism. And the first international science year was held with Antarctica as its subject. And it never became colonized by anybody. It's a continent which is cooperatively looked after. That's a Russian snowcat on its way to Vostok. Russian base is called Vostok, which means east, like Vladivostok. And they call their spaceships Vostok, and the boat that took the first Russian to Antarctica was called Vostok. But the final thing was reaching the pole, and there is a terrible, sad story of Captain Scott, who got there 3 weeks after the Norwegians did. This is the disconsolate Scott party at Amundsen's camp. He left them a pair of skis in case they wanted to get back, which they didn't do. They died on their way back, so broken were they by the disappointment of not getting there first. That's the cairn the search party built over Scott's body, which is on the Ross ice shelf. This is the Antarctica is ringed by these big shells of ice which are pushing slowly. All the ice is moving slowly out towards the sea. It builds up. You can see the striation lines on the top where there's a build-up of ice. About 2 feet every year. This goes on for hundreds of thousands of years. You can drill down and get evidence of atmospheric pollution 100,000 years ago. But anyway, Scott was on this ice shelf when he died. And because of the build-up, 2 feet a year, it means that his bones are going down into the ice shelf. And this is 150 feet high, but because it's iceberg material, it comes down to here somewhere, 700 feet thick, and every summer bits of it break off and float out into the ocean. And it can be calculated that in 120 years' time, Scott's bones will be down in the center of this thing and will break off in an iceberg and float off towards New Zealand. This is my painting of Antarctica. On the same spot now, there is this enormous US geodesic dome. the flags of the nations who are taking part in the experiment of looking after Antarctica. This is Havelock. I put this in because it says here, soldiers, your labors, your privations, your sufferings, and your valor will not be forgotten by a grateful country. Major General Henry Havelock. And it's hard to find people who can remember who Havelock is. And in 2050, you see, that's 1857. In 2050, people might not remember who Scott is either. Robert Falcon Scott. Falcon is already forgotten. This is a statue which is on the Finchley Road, north of Temple Fortune. It's a present from the French government in gratitude for us helping them with the war. Now, the Western Front is... The Western Front was a war of... It wasn't stalemate because there was too much going on, but it was a war where two armies came together and stuck in the ground. And these are two trenches facing each other, which are maybe 5 kilometers apart, down to a couple of 100 yards. And this ground is like that. It's completely wrecked ground. And this goes on for 150 miles in that direction. This is in Neuve-Chapelle, 150 miles south of it. There's 300 miles of this ribbon of churned up land. Now, I'm really gripped by this thing, as I think it's overshadowed the whole century. I think it's full of analogies for me. Like, I wonder, it seems to me that was the closing event of the coherence of the imperial age, completely blown to bits by what happened on the Western Front. And when people talk about the collapse of legitimizing narratives of the power of the state in favor of individual interpretation of events, which I think is basically what criticism is about these days, they're talking about this landscape. It's blown to bits and it's full of rubbish. And it's full of people picking bits up and talking about them. It's like camouflage. I don't know, these are fairly new thoughts about camouflage that I've been trying to have. These are flighted mirages over Ronchamp. And nothing is what it seems. If these are camouflage, Ronchamp looks like a big solid building, but in fact it's a concrete frame. I was astonished when I discovered that. Why? And these dogs here, these are in the Natural History Museum in Tring, which is applied for lottery funding, I expect. And they're stuffed domestic dogs. And what was interesting to me was the survival of camouflage in the way they're bred. That Dalmatian, and the Alsatian here with his black and grey, and their white bellies. But the camouflage is an interesting, never-ending analogy for modern times. These are my two favorite slides. I show them every lecture. That's Ludwig, Mad Ludwig's Neuschwanstein. This is Disney World. That's a fantasy of the 14th century, built in 1830-something. This is a fantasy of a fantasy. It's a double copy. I was talking about not being a snob, but I can't take Disneyland on board. I really can't. I think that you go to Disneyland if you're too tired to travel. Or maybe if you're too tired to argue with the kids. We're going to Ronchamp. Dad! Anyway, this welter of thoughts is... my intention was that this bunch of thoughts would reside in this painting. There's Kurt Vonnegut once wrote about history writing and comedy writing, how the history writers sneered at the way he wrote history. And he said, I'm writing comedy, and comedy is much harder because every page you have to think up 3, 4 different things. Whereas a history writer can just waffle on and on about stuff that isn't even his own idea. And I've always liked that, but I think I'm trying to write both. I think that the situation is so complicated that the dialogues and the set pieces and the anecdotes are an attempt to trap that complexity. But it's still divided territory. When I showed What is Architecture to John Summerson for his opinion, and he said, he's 85, beware of poisoning the wells of truth. Now these are two, this is back to the front, back to the western front. This is Beaucaire, which is about 10 kilometers behind the front line, where Haig had his quarters. This is Puiseaux, which was right bang on in the Battle of the Somme. Beaucaire survived, and Puiseaux was completely demolished to one of those photographs I showed a bit earlier on. And this is like, I call it D'Artagnan's France. It has lead finials and hips and stone church, slate roof. And poor old Puiseaux, which presumably was like this, it's only 10 kilometers away, was rebuilt in the 20s by the French repairing the thing. This is the character, this is the strategy. It's not the war that I'm interested in, it's the repair job that was done. Because there's this long, narrow strip of land which suddenly was exploded and has now been repaired. And you can still see where this wound was stitched up. You know, like you have a scar which still shows white. It's like that. And part of it is these little villages, a whole string of them along the front, which have been built in the 20s, where just at the most difficult time that architects could possibly imagine, with all that modern coming and all the old stuff going and nobody knowing what to do. And they have these funny concrete churches with little bits of stone stuck like badges on them. The French, I was reading that the French didn't have the depression that the Germans had because they knew the Germans were going to pay for everything. They just got on with repairing it. Who's paying for this? The Germans. But it's got that hand of fist quality. This is Passchendaele. This is before and after. So this was, the Passchendaele is way up to the north in Belgium, but, well, they say the bombardment was so thick it was like teeth chattering. And down there in the mud were these guys who are down there in that photograph somewhere. It's a Canadian machine gun company. And it's impossible to resist comparing that life with Clemenceau and Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George negotiating the peace. But the peace came, and all the farmland was returned and replanted, and all along the line of the front now are the little cemeteries which the British Army still maintain and will forever maintain. There are stones in all the cemeteries which say forever. This one is Munich Trench. You can probably just see that little white spot there, which is another cross of another cemetery. Whenever you're in one, you can see another one, because they're only half a kilometre apart. The one in the distance is 800 yards away, and that's the jump-off point for the Battle of the Somme. And this is in the Munich Trench, which is a German support trench, where the last people died 5 months later. But they're beautiful, these places. They're so assiduously kept. And the whole thing has this theme park quality of it, except that the story is big. It's 7:15. Every night at 8 o'clock, in 3/4 of an hour, they'll be doing this. They stand under the Menin Gate at Ypres and they blow the last post every single night. And well, it's like, it is the Disney parade, but it means much more. Now, it is an extraordinary landscape because it's a secular sacred landscape. The prayer at the last post is silence, 2 minutes of silence. And the cemeteries are egalitarian, officers and men buried together, and they're creedless, all religions together. But the imperial nature of the thing does overtake it tactically. It has this triumphal character, and this big sarcophagus stone here, which has a curve on it. 900 feet above the ground is the point where all the verticals taper to. 1,000 feet below is where the horizontals are taken as a gentle curve, which you can see in that photograph. I wanted to look at Scotland because I was very taken by the Great Glen. I thought it had something to do with the way the tribes, the clans, worked. The Great Glen runs through the centre of Scotland, and it picks up the other glens as they come into it. And the attempt by the rebellion to turn Scotland into one nation took place along this glen, and it's now what's his name? Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived at the bottom of Glenfinnan, and the final battle was at the top at Culloden. And the other thing that struck me about it was the three forts: Fort William, Fort Augustus, and Fort George, which are the remnants of that old contest. Now, this is the second wilderness story. This is evolution. I've read a book called The Ascent of Woman, and I can't remember the author's name, but reading it struck me enormously. The idea was that humans evolved in the sea. In a drought 10 million years ago, a party of apes went to escape the heat on the beach and stayed there up to their necks in water until it was over, and meanwhile evolved as we are. It explains our hairlessness, like the dolphins. It explains why we can talk like the dolphins. And it explains why we're upright. This isn't upright, this is horizontal for swimming. At the end of this period, we came out and assumed our life on land, having learned how to talk and thus able to dominate the rest of the world, whereas the dolphins stayed in the sea and went on evolving. Now, they travel in schools. You know, the definition of a school is a group of animals traveling together for the same purpose. And so I'm wondering about herds and our own relation to the other mammals, and flocks, which are less hierarchical than herds, and packs, which is how the dogs work it, and tribes, which is how we work it. I think we're evolved to live in tribes and be nomadic. And our cities are against this grain, which is why we have so much trouble with them. We can't be nomadic because we have to move with the rest of the tribe. We want all our friends to go with us. These are two individuals who are as savage as each other. This is a leopard seal, which, unlike all the other seals, lives a solitary life and eats other seals. That's why he's got those teeth. This is the Duke of Cumberland, Augustus, who from Fort Augustus masterminded the extermination of the clan system in Scotland. The way they did it was to bribe the clan chiefs, who are feudal fathers, to raise the rents, which up till now had been a fatted calf and a snowball, to money, so that the clansmen couldn't pay it, so they could be evicted from their land. And the whole place was cleared out and turned over to sheep farming. Now, that's an uncomfortable strategy to have discovered. I didn't know I was going to find that when I looked at Scotland and started thinking about nationhood. But I'm glad I did. I think we all came from the same place, and we all spread out of the world in this tribal nomadic thing, and we've been invading each other's valleys and fighting about it ever since. This is Fort George, which governs the entrance to Loch Ness at the top end. This is Glenfinnan with the monument to the lone Highlander. Well, since I found I was talking about death so much, I thought I might as well throw this in. This is just such an amazing thing. It's in the chapel in Windsor Castle, and I don't know who it is. It's one of the royal queens. Look at these fingers underneath here. A statuary like this is a lost art. It's gone. You couldn't get anybody to do it if you wanted it. Anyway, that's kind of somber. This is Ben Nevis, which is the bottom of Fort George. And the Dutch have discovered this fantastic way of making new land. This is the Oostpolder, Flevoland. And I don't understand why it's better known. If people are looking at my exhibition upstairs, they've heard of everywhere, Scotland and wherever else it is, the London Basin, Antarctica. These are familiar, but the Flevoland, where's that? And it's this enormous engineering endeavor which has been going on since 1916 and is not quite yet finished, to make new land in Holland. This is a Landsat, and this is from the Challenger shuttle, Hasselblad. You can see here the big, this is the dam that crosses the mouth. This is upside down. You can just see the little white line of the dam. This used to be a big inland sea which regularly flooded and inundated the interior of the country. And in 1916 they finally decided to put an end to this once and for all by building this big dike across the top and controlling the amount of water that could get into the interior. So the thing is really a flood control exercise. That's coming down closer to the dike, and these are the huge sluices, heroic, which control the water coming in and out of the Isselmeer. In fact, going out of the Isselmeer, because what happens all the time, what happens all the time is that this is the Rhine. The Issel is a tributary of the Rhine, and it's pouring fresh water into this enormous lagoon all the time, and they let it out into the sea. Now I've got to reschedule all this on there. Yeah. Now, on the polders themselves are more dikes like that where the land has been drained out. It takes a year and you pump all the water out, and then you have this huge great mud flat. Fly over it in a plane and you sow reeds which can grow in the salt mud. And you crop these all the time, and after 5 or 10 years you can start growing alfalfa and hardy grasses, and after another 5 or 10 years you can start growing corn and eating it. And all around, this is one of the polders, and all around the edge of it there's a large canal like that with sluices which are controlling the water, and this is a daily event. It's all controlled by computers, and the water coming in and out is daily controlled by these things. It's a huge 80-kilometer square irrigation machine. And what was just so incredible about it is that the strategy of flood control means you can reverse the thing. In very, very hot weather, like these big dry Augusts we've been having, the whole of the Isselmeer Lake is allowed to rise by 30 centimeters. And then it's let back through this system of sluices, down the canals and into ditches to irrigate the ground. So not only have they flood controlled the whole thing and made all this new land, but it never suffers the drought that the rest of Europe suffers. Now, what could be more different than invading somebody's valley and killing everybody in it? But they haven't finished. They've stopped doing it. There's one more polder to do, and they've stopped doing it. And I can't figure out why. I mean, you could do it to Venice. You could save Venice by this method. You could do it to the Ganges. Save millions of lives in Bangladesh doing this. This is looking out over the last dike. This is to be a polder. That's a dike. You can't see it in the distance. You can see this boat sail here. And this little spot here isn't a boat, that's a truck which is making its way from one side of the Isselmeer to the other. Now, if you swivel around 90 degrees and look at the interior of the polder, you find that you're on the edge of the nature reserve. There's a huge nature reserve, the middle of which is arranged so that no one goes there. No one has ever been there. No wardens go there. No human ever goes in there. It's new land, but it's new wilderness land. They call it the silent core. And I can't think that they've stopped doing this for any other reason, but the ecologists have turned around and said, you're depriving the waders of their ground. I realized that all the horizons, the perpetual horizons I was showing, are something to do with being human. I had this idea once that we were all living in bowls in the ground, which were eye-height bowls with us in the middle. When you climb up a high building, the bowl gets bigger, and when you go down a hole, the bowl gets smaller. On the corner of the Bank of England, there's a point in the pavement where you go round the corner, and the wall separates from the rest of the building and is here, and there's the bank, and here's the wall, and up there, and there's a circle in the sky. And it's the only place in the city where you can go and you look up and you can't see any buildings. It's an artificial, pure skyline. Now, why did I say that? This is on the cover of the book because he is so surrounded by his cultivation and yet still scared shitless by the wilderness. But NASA sends humans into space because there wouldn't be any point in doing it by remote control. You could explore space. You could colonize all the other planets by machinery. But there wouldn't be any point, because to explore is to be human. It's a human thing to do. They would never get anybody to vote the money to do it if people didn't go up there. I think this is, I thought it was going to be Bridget Butter again. Bear's fur eyelashes. And this is the picture of Doré looking, I think it's by Doré, of the savage looking at London sometime in the future. And this is to remind me to go back to the beginning, because I was talking to Robert Harbison. Cultivated wilderness. Oh yes, he says. Difficult title. I say, yeah, it's difficult to say. Cultivated wilderness. Long words. One of them's Latin root, cultivated. The other's a German root, wilderness. And I thought, oh God, it's classic Gothic. It must be more complicated than that. And it is, because it's not an opposition. The wilderness is the master of all this, as I tried to explain before. In 1 million years' time, there will be new rocks made of the sedimented remains of London's brick, which will be cultivation, wilderness. Now, the Seven Wonders of the World is the last thing in this set, and it's always been a bit of an odd thing to have it there. the point, as you discovered in that recent television program about the Seven Wonders of the World, is that the Seven Wonders are not wonderful. You know, they're ancient, balmy things. But what they are is the seven most interesting, impressive things in Alexander's empire. This new one world, which was all the luxury of Persia and all the intelligence of Greece combined into one thing. What a world. What's in it? The Seven Wonders. Now, it quickly turns into a party game about, well, we've got one world now. We've looked at it from space, and there's the planet. Can we suppose we have one cultivation? What's in it? So this is a stab at it. I was looking through my childhood Guinness Book of Records, my 1958 copy. It says that there's a taller statue than the Statue of Liberty of a Buddha 170 feet high in Afghanistan, which I've never heard of. It said also that behind Mount Rushmore, this is 1958, somebody had been working for 15 years on a statue of Crazy Horse, which was 500 feet high. That's as high as the NatWest Tower. And it was all being done with dynamite from the solid rock. And this guy had been blasting away for 15 years, and he had another 35 years to go. And I've never heard of that either. I think he must have given up. But they were in one world, and I think these are the two things we have now in our world. St. Paul's doesn't really work in this company. This is the Hubble. This is the Kaaba, which is the focus for 1,000 million people every day face towards this thing when they pray, 5 times a day. It's survived at that spiritual intensity since 600 and something. It's a 10-meter cube. Set into the corner is a meteorite which fell to Earth with Adam when he was expelled from paradise. It was white when it fell, but it's been turned black by the kisses of so many sinful men. Now, I think these are on opposite tracks, these things. The openness of scientific inquiry and the absoluteness of faith. And they both think they can accommodate the other. And I think we're going to have to wait to find out whether we do get one world out of this situation. It's spooky that Hubble and Hubble, X-Files. Because all the time I was doing this, these are the eyes of Alexander from a little head in the British Museum. All the time I was doing this, it took about 3 years to write this book. And David Attenborough did that program about Antarctica, and then there was the program about the Seven Wonders. There was all this stuff about tall buildings in the London basin, recently this Foster thing. Scottish devolution, the nationality of Scotland has become an issue recently. Lynn Thingamy won her Booker Prize for the Stories of the Western Front last year. And it was though I was working on what everybody else was working on. And I think this is what we call knowledge. And it's whether you can make any patterns out of this knowledge, out of your own experience, that makes the difference. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Thank you. The custom is, I can never remember whether the custom is to ask the questions or to say, we don't have any questions. And I think probably we still do things the second way, don't we? That we're going up to the bar and it might be possible to purloin me and argue against this stuff. Okay, thank you.